So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Michael Fratt. I'm the Assistant Program Director at Drisha, and very excited to welcome folks back for the next class of Your Name Shall Be Great, the Avraham narrative with Rabbi Silber. We have been working our way through. We got part of the way through Perek Yud Daled, chapter 14 last time, and we'll be continuing in there with some of the material related to the relationship between Avraham and Lot. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Silber, and we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, great. So actually, we finished up chapter 13 last time, where Avraham was commanded after Lot leaves to, in the words of the Torah, Kum hitalech ba'aretz li'arka u'rachba, to walk through the land in its breadth and width, ki lecha etnena. So Avraham is essentially engaged, one might say, in a symbolic possession of the land. His walking through the land prefigures a time when his descendants will actually possess the land. Avraham does so. In the last verse of chapter 13, he pitches his tent. He dwells, Vayeshev be'elonei Mamre. He dwells in Elonei Mamre, which is Hebron, and there he builds an altar. So he's essentially, outside of the detour to Egypt, he's been in three places. He enters at Shechem, he travels near Beit El, and now he's in Hebron. That's the end of chapter 13. And chapter 14, which is a very interesting chapter, it sounds like it feels different and sounds different from what we've encountered in the last two chapters. So let's begin with chapter 14. You have it on your screen. Vayhi bimei Amrafel melech Shinar, Aryoch melech Elasar, Kedara Omer melech Elam, V'tidor melech Goyim, Asu milchama et Bera melech Sodom v'et Birsha melech Amorah, Shinav melech Adma, V'shem Ever melech Tzroyim, U'melech Bela Hitzorah. Kol Eila Chavu Emek Hasidim U'yam HaMelech. So the chapter begins by saying, in the days of, and it lists four kings, beginning with Amraphel, the king of Shinar, three additional kings, and they made war, and it lists five kings, beginning with the king of Saddam, his name is Bera, and the king of Amorah, Birsha, three additional kings. All of them, Chavru, joined together, came together in the valley of Sidim, which is Yam HaMelach, literally the salt sea, which we call the Dead Sea. So it's funny, the text, Vayhi bimei, is not a typical beginning of a chapter. We have it elsewhere, the book of Ruth. Vayhi bimei Shvot HaShoftim, at the time of the judges, and the following story takes place. We have it in Megillat Esther, Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, in the days of Achashverosh, and we have the story of the Megillah. And here in chapter 14, Vayhi bimei, in the days of, and it lists four kings. And interesting is that the first king mentioned is Amraphel, the king of Shinar. Now, Shinar we have encountered earlier in the Torah in chapter 9, chapter 11, Tower of Babel, that the world comes together in Babel, which is Shinar, Be'eretz Shinar. We know that Shinar is a place identified with Babel. It's identified with Nimrod. Reshit ma'amachto Babel Be'eretz Shinar. The Torah says in chapter 10 that Nimrod, who's the first king of the Bible, his kingship begins in Shinar in Babel. So it is striking that this chapter begins in the days of, and it lists the kings, four kings, and the first king mentioned is the king of Shinar. And that's striking for a different reason. And the reason is the following, that in chapter 14, which speaks of the war between the four kings and the five kings, the names listed in the first two verses, the main king of the four, the main protagonist in the chapter, is not Amraphel. Amraphel is never mentioned again. The person, the king, who is central in the rebellion of the five against the four, is in fact Kedara Omer, who's mentioned third in the list. Kedara Omer Melech Elam, the king of Elam. So it is interesting And this all takes place in the time of, and the king mentioned first is Shinar. So the Torah, I would suggest, wants us in reading the chapter to think about the story of Bavel, to think about Shinar. So for whatever reason, maybe we'll touch upon this later, the Migdal Bavel story is on our minds as we are about to read this chapter. And there's going to be a war in the chapter between the 4 kings and the 5 kings. They all join together, we're told in verse number 3, and if we continue down, it says, Shtemes Reishana of Duat Kedara Omer, Ushloshas Reishana Maradu. They served Kedara Omer for 12 years. They rebelled in the 13th. V'yarbas Asrei Shana ba Kedara Omer. The next verse, it says, verse number 5, in the 14th year, Kedara Omer came. V'hamulachim asher ito, and the kings that were with him, the other 3 kings. And one expects at this point, presumably, that the Torah will tell us of the great battle that took place between these 4 kings and the 5 kings. After all, that's how the chapter begins. But to our surprise, actually, in the ensuing verses, it says absolutely nothing about the 5 kings fighting the 4 kings. You would expect that the 4 kings, the 5 rebelled against them, maradu. Notice the word maradu, to rebel. That word maradu is familiar to us because we had it earlier in the Torah. Nimrod means literally we shall rebel. So once again, there's a literary allusion to the story of Bavel. But the reader expects, I think, that in the 14th year, Kedara Omer came with his armies and his allies and fought against the 5 kings. That's not what happens in the text. The war that takes place between these 4 kings is not a war against the 5 kings. It's a war against a different set of peoples, and we'll come to that in a moment. Let's come to it now, in fact. Let's see the list of kings, of peoples that the 4 kings defeat. So Vayakut Rifaim Biyashderot Kanaim, Yet Hazuzim Baham, Yet Toimim Bishavet Kiryatayim. So in this verse, it mentions 3 peoples, beginning with Rifaim. Rifaim we know of from the Torah, from elsewhere, and from the Bible. Rifaim are giants.
Yeah.
Giants. So they defeated the giants in Ashderot Kanaim. Zuzim, mentioned elsewhere, are also very, very powerful people. Amim, Amos fear, I would say the dreadnoughts, Bishavet Kiryatayim. So we're talking over here, beginning with the Rifaim, with the giants. We're talking about extremely powerful peoples. At Hachori, in the next verse, Hachori Bahararam Seir, Adel Paran Ashel Hamidbar, and defeated the Chori in the hill country of Seir, which is by the wilderness. Now let's read a little more, and then we'll reflect upon these verses. Vayashuvu vayavo ein mishpati kadesh, and they, on their way back, they're traveling from north to south. On the way back, vayaku et kol sadeho amaleki, v'gama to Emori, hayoshev b'chatzatzan tamar. It mentions 2 other peoples, the field of Amalek, Sadei Amaleki, and also the Emori, who dwell in Chatzatzan Tamar. These are the list of nations that the 4 kings defeat. And actually, in thinking about this list of nations that the 4 kings defeat, they're on their way back now. This list should sound familiar to some of us, certain names on the list, because a similar list appears in the first chapter of the book of Devarim. The Amim, the Zuzim, the Chori, and also the Rifaim, because in the first chapter, actually 3 chapters of Devarim, if you remember, Moshe speaking in the last year of his life, reflecting back on the desert journey, and they're coming to the border of the land, And God gives instruction there that certain nations you should not attack. You should not attack Seir, Esav, Bnei Esav. You should not attack Ammon. You should not attack Moab. And the reason that the Torah gives, you should not attack these nations, because God gave them their land. They are entitled to their land. That's what the Torah says. And the Torah brings proof that God gave them their land. What is the proof that God gave them their land? So let me read to you from the first chapter of Dvarim. Let's see. This would be in chapter, actually it's the second chapter. I take it back. Chapter 2 of Sefer Dvarim. You're coming to it starts with Esav. Chapter 2, you're coming to the land of Esav, Seir. Do not start war with them, says the Torah. Go around them. Al tiskaru bam. You can purchase, why not? Ki rushali Esav natati et har Seir. I gave Esav har Seir. And the Torah adduces proof that the land of Seir was given to Esav, because the Torah says, because prior to Esav, because prior to living in Esav, the Chori lived in the land of Esav. So therefore, what does that mean? It means if the Chori lived in the land of Esav, how could Esav possess this land? If the Chori were there, how could they possibly defeat them? It must be that God assisted them. Or for example, the next group of Moab. There it says, don't start war for them. Kiluv Lo, this is in chapter 2, verse number 9. This is very clear. Because I gave Lot the possession, their land. Ha'emim lifanim yoshvu ba. Before they were there, the Emim, mentioned in our chapter, were there. The Emim were there. Verse 11, Rifaim yechashu afem kanakim. V'moavim yikru lahem Emim. U'v'seir yashu hachorim lifanim. Verse number 12. So Esav and Moab, it's their land. How do you know it's their land? Because before they were there, the Chori were in the land of Esav. The Rephaim, called the Emim, were in the land of Moab. So therefore, it's impossible to defeat them. So obviously, it must be that God assisted them in possessing their land. So therefore, you can't touch their land. And what's interesting is that's chapter 2. Later in chapter 3, it talks about the first successful war of Israel in capturing the land of Kanan, which takes place on the other side of the Jordan, Ever Hayarden. And they're attacked by two kings of Emori. And the two kings are Sichon Melech Emori and Og Melech HaBashan. That's mentioned also in the book of Bamidbar. But in Sefer Devarim, it talks about Og as being Og Melech HaBashan Nishar Meyeta HaRefaim. He's one of those who remain from the Refaim. That is to say, the same way Moab and Esav, their lands were given to them by God, as evidenced by the fact that the Emim, the Refaim, the Chori were there before. So Israel as well. Israel as well. If we defeated Og as one of the Refaim, that's a demonstration that God gave us our land. In short, the list of names in our chapter, defeated by the four kings, is consonant with the list that we find in the beginning of Sefer Devarim. And in fact, when it comes to the next nation, which is Ammon, we also can't start war with Ammon, because with Nelot, Netatia, Yerusha, also in chapter 3 of chapter 2 of Devarim, verse number 19, Eretz Rifaim Techoshev Afi. Rifaim Yashvu Balifanim, Hoamim, Yikru Lahem Zamzumim. So they call them Zamzumim. So we have Esav, Ammon, Moab, we have Emim, we have Rifaim, we have Chori, we have Zamzumim, And over here we have Zuzim. In verse number 5, Hazuzim Baham, Eto Emim B'Shaveh Kiryatayim. In short, what does the significance of the war, not against the 5 nobody kings, but against these peoples, what does it mean? It means that what the 4 kings have done, essentially, is to defeat the nations that dwell in the land of Canaan. Now, what nations dwell in the land of Canaan in Genesis chapter 14? We have those mentioned above, basically the giants. And now in verse number 7, on the way back home, they defeat 2 more peoples. Sidei Amaleki, the field of Amalek. I'll get to Amalek in a moment. The Gameto Emori, Hayoshev B'Chatzatzan Tamar, and they defeat the Emori. Now the Emori, we know of the Emori as one of the 7 Canaanite nations. In fact, typically when the Torah speaks about the land of these 7 nations, sometimes there's 6 nations, usually it's 7 nations, sometimes it's 10 nations. But the generic term for these nations usually is Kanan. Kanan is one of the nations, but the land is called Eretz Kanan or Kanani. We had it earlier, HaKanani v'haPrizi oz Yoshev ba'aretz, and often the land is called Eretz Kanan. Sometimes it's called the Emori, the land of the Emori. Here in our verse, it talks about the Emori. The Emori are interesting, actually. Sometimes they're representative of the peoples of Canaan, but we know from a verse in Treasar that it speaks of the Emori as being giants. Kigova arazim gavho, v'chasonu ka'aronim. So it's interesting that the Emori specifically is singled out over here in the context of those who inhabit the land, who are giants. The Emori we think of as Canaanites, but there's also a sense in which they're giants. Sichon Melech Emori is also a giant. So what's interesting is in the list, they're essentially capturing, one might say, the people who possess the land, the ancients who possess the land, and included in this list is Amalek, Sidei HaAmaleki, which itself is very interesting because, of course, we know that Amalek is Esav's grandson. So Amalek is not yet born. Amalek is mentioned in chapter 36 of Genesis as being the grandson of Esav. So here, presumably, in my view, it's saying something else about Amalek. Leave out the question of Amalek being Esav's grandson. There's another element to Amalek. Amalek may be Esav's grandson, but there's a sense in the context of these verses that Amalek is a kind of primordial power. I have often connected it, and with good reason, to the story of the Nachash. The Nachash and Amalek are very, very parallel, actually. What we have over here is, in short, the 4 kings are symbolically defeating, actually, the peoples of Canaan. And there are 2 kinds of people that dwell in the land of Canaan. There are the giants, and they are the Emori, who may be giants as well. When we think of Emori, we think of the Canaanites. It's interesting, by the way, without getting into the depth of it, we remember the story of the spies or the scouts that Moshe sends to scout out the land preliminary, he hopes, to the conquest of the land. Bamidbar chapter 13, the Meraglim. And when they come back, they report about the peoples of the land. And essentially what they say is we can't defeat them. And whom did they single out? We went into the land, they said, a land which devours its inhabitants. And there we saw Nephilim, B'nai Anak Minhalas Nephilim. We saw the Nephilim. Nephilim are mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, the giants. B'nai Anakim. And in addition, they say, Amalek Yoshev B'Eretz HaNegev. There are the Canaanites there, but they're the giants there. And the giants think of us as grasshoppers. We see ourselves as grasshoppers, and that's how they see us. In other words, the point of that chapter, among other things, and this is a very important point, is that those who possess the land are not just the Canaanites, but there are ancient possessors of the land. I would say the Nephilim, the giants mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, who take by force, who take without consent, and they are God's enemy. So God has two enemies. God has the Canaanites, but the land is also possessed by God's ancient antagonists. And what the four kings have done, essentially, is to defeat those that dwell in the land of Kanan, who are both Canaanites or Amorites on one hand. On the other hand, they are the giants, the Rephaim, the Nephilim, the Anakim, etc., etc. This is a very important point about this chapter. This is a chapter, may I just say, hate to say it, but I will, it's not understood by too many people. Even though they write a lot about it, they don't actually understand it. So we're going to get to an understanding of chapter 14. It's a very important chapter. They're all important, in particular important chapter. This is what has happened so far. So the four kings have not come to quash the five kings. There are some commentaries who are very bothered by this. What happened to the rebellion of the five kings? So they suggest, among other things, maybe these are allies of the five kings. But actually, it's certainly possible. That's not the focus of the chapter at all. Focus is not about the five kings, because the five kings are five nobodies. The four kings are four powerful kings, as we shall see shortly. Now let's continue our story, and I'll stop and take some comments or questions. Verse number 7, Vayetze melech Saddam, umelech Amorah, umelech Admah melech Tzvayim, umelech Bela Hitzoar. So these five kings, starting with the king of Saddam and Amorah and the others, Vayarchu itam milchama b'emek hasidim. And they engaged them in war. So the five attacked the four. And now the Torah repeats in the next verse. Whom did they attack? Kedora Omer melech Eram, Tidal melech Goyim, Amraphel melech Shinar, Arioch melech Elasar. Then the Torah adds, Arba'ar melachim et hachamisha. The four against the five. Now let's pause for a moment and reflect on this verse. The four against the five. I've often asked in my classes, let me ask you a question. Who has the advantage in the battle? Do the four have the advantage, or do the five have the advantage? And usually, I didn't take a census of this account, but for the most part, the answer is, well, the five have the advantage. I say, why do the five have the advantage? Well, because five is bigger than four. Now, when you reflect upon that answer, which is the answer usually given, of course, it's a ridiculous answer. It's foolish. But it's a foolish answer. It's a stupid answer. But the Torah has set us up. Because the Torah says 4 against 5. It's 4 against 5. Why is it foolish? Because the 5 are 5 little nobodies dwelling around the Dead Sea. The 4 are 4 giants. And not just because they defeat all these powerful nations, but because that's how the chapter begins. And it came to pass in the days of the king of Shinar. It came to pass in the days of Achashverosh, because Achashverosh in the Megillah is king of the world. It came to pass in the time of the judges, the corrective judges. That makes sense. It came to pass in the time of Shinar, the time of Amraphel, the time of Nimrod. That makes sense. It came to pass in the time of Alexander the Great. Makes sense. It came to pass in the time of some little mayor someplace or other. Makes no sense. So therefore we know, and we know from the name, Shinar, the world gathered once in Bavel. The whole world gathered there. Elam, big. Goyim sounds big, nations. So the 4 against the 5, the question is, why does the Torah say 4 against the 5? And I would suggest the following. There is a critique over here of the 4 and the 5. It's actually interesting that before, recall the verse said, Kol elech chavru el emek hasidim huyam hamelech. They all joined together, chavru. L'chaber is to join together. A chaver is a friend. And the last verses of the previous chapter tell us about Avraham being told by God after Lot leaves, you keep going. There's a covenant between us. Where does Avraham go and build his altar? Hebron. Hebron, place of joining. So Avraham joins up with God covenantally in Hebron. The 4 kings and the 5 kings who will do battle have gathered, have joined together. Because in a certain sense, the 5 and the 4 are similar. In a funny way, it's 5 against 4, says the Torah. What does that mean? It means that from the perspective of the kings, it's 5 against 4. There are no other people over here. These are not kings who are thinking about their obligation to serve their people. They're thinking about one person, which is themselves. So in a funny way, it's 5 against 4. And here we have a critique of kingship. And it takes us back to the first king, to Nimrod, to Babel. That's all negative. Migdal Babel is about human beings thinking of themselves potentially as ascending the heavens, of equaling God. So there is a critique in this chapter, and a powerful critique about kingship with the 5 and the 4, and we'll get to that later. But the point is, it would appear, now let's get back to our verses, then I'll stop, take some comments or questions. So the 5 attack the 4. After all, they outnumber them. They're 5 against 4. And now we have the so-called war. That's how the chapter began. The war, the great war of the 5 rebel kings against the 4. Now here's how the Torah describes this war. B'yemek HaSidim, the valley of Sidim, Be'erot Chemar, was dotted with bitumen pits. That's another link to the story of Migdal Babel. HaChemar hayolahem lachomer. That's how they're going to build their tower, with Chemar. Vayanusu melech Sodom v'Amorah vayipru shama. The king of Sodom and Amorah ran, and they fell there. V'anisharim heranasu. The remaining fled to the mountains. So they fell. Here they fell into the pits. The term to fall is often used to fall in battle, we say in English, and we have it in the Bible as well. But here, in this non-war, because how could there be a war? They simply fall into the pits. The remainder run away. Vayikhu, so the 4 kings took. Et kol ruchush Sodom v'Amorah v'et kol acham. They took the possessions, they took the food. Vayelechu, and they walked. They're walking home. They continue, oh, there's some food here to take, some possessions, let's take it. Next verse, Vayichu et Lot v'et ruchusho. They took Lot and his possessions. Ben achi Avram vayelechu. Avram's nephew, and they walked. Who Yoshev Bestom, and Lot at this point was dwelling in Saddam. In chapter 13, it said he pitched his tent unto Saddam, but apparently he dwells in Saddam. Now let's stop here for one moment, and I'll take the comments or questions. And that is, what kind of war is this? Answer: there is no war. There can't be a war between these 4 unbelievably powerful nations who defeat the giants and these 5 nobodies. And in fact, there is no war. The 5 instantly attack the 4. It's not clear that the 4 even know they're being attacked. It's a mosquito on an elephant. So they come and run out. They fall there. And the Torah plays the word to fall in battle. They fall into the pits. Into Emek HaSidim. Remember, Sidim is playing off Sodom. They fell into the pits of Sidim, which is called Yam HaMelach in the beginning of the chapter. Melach is salt. Melach is king. So it's playing, Torah's having a good time over here. And they're walking home. So they take the Rechush. There is no actual war over here. There is a war, an important war of the 4 kings against the giants. That's true. But this war is a non-war. Amongst the possessions they take and the people they take is Lot. Lot had settled in Sodom, Behu Yoshev Bestom, and that's the background for Abraham's intervention, assistance, entrance into the battle. And what the chapter, of course, is actually about would not be about the 5 nobodies and the 4 kings. But at the center of this chapter, this is a very important point, is Avram's battle against the 4 kings. Now, before we continue, I will stop here and take any comments or questions, and then we'll continue with this chapter. Probably won't finish it this week, but we'll starting here. If anybody has comments or questions, please speak up.
It seems to me that possibly Vayiplu is meaning to say that actually the 5 kings fall into the category of the Nephilim, which warring against the Nephilim was the project of the 4 kings.
That's actually a very interesting thought. I hadn't thought about that. Vayiplu playing off Nephilim in the broader context of Rephaim, that's a very interesting observation. Thank you for that observation. That is interesting. Could have to think more about that, which doesn't contradict what I said.
No.
Not at all. But it's an additional literary effect. This chapter has many, many interesting, among other things, literary effects, which we'll get to. Its chapter is constructed in a quite ingenious way. Of course, beyond all the ingenuity and the cleverness, which we appreciate, is a very profound point about chapter 14. Chapter 14, everything's important. Chapter 14, when you read it, sounds like a less important, if that can be said, chapter, but that's not true. Chapter 14 is a chapter of enormous significance for the storyline of the Torah, and the rabbinic tradition understood this to the end. We'll get to this later on. Anybody else have any comments? Thank you for that comment. Interesting. Anybody else?
A quick. I noticed that it was, as you were saying this, that they seem to be doing God's work. The four kings, particularly against Amalek and so on, the Kanan. And I'm just wondering, these are not supposed to be such. Bavel is a sort of negative thing. So it seems a little odd that they're.
No, I didn't say they're doing God's work. I never suggested that. No, that's not what I said.
I know.
I said something else. I had a different thought in mind. It's not that they're doing God's work. I'll answer your question by sort of jumping ahead to what I am saying. I didn't spell it out. What I'm suggesting is that the point of chapter 14 is that when Avraham defeats the four kings, what I'm saying is that what the four kings have done for their own selfish purposes, they just attack because they can attack because they're powerful. No, they're not. God is the last thing on their mind. But my point is, they having essentially defeated the peoples of Canaan, subjugated the peoples of Canaan, that when Avraham defeats them, which he will do in the chapter, somehow he is symbolically conquering the land. That's my point. At the story of chapter 14, what it's about and the great significance of it, understood by the rabbinic tradition. And it will become crystal clear when we look at this chapter, crystal clear. And that is what the point of chapter 14 is. Avraham is actually going to symbolically possess, through war, possess the land of Canaan. He has, in a certain sense, symbolically possesses it by walking through the land. And he will also symbolically possess it by purchasing the gravesite for Sarah, Marat Machpelah. Just as, for example, later on in this book, in chapters 33 and 34, Yaakov will escape from Esav, come back home, purchase a space near Shechem at the end of chapter 33, and then his sons will capture Shechem, in a sense, defeat Shechem, which becomes a kind of precursor for the conquest of the land. So in the case of Yaakov, there's a war of Shechem, and there's a purchase of Shechem. In the case of Avraham, there's a war and a purchase as well. The war is Avram's war against the four kings. And the reason the Torah goes into so much detail about whom the four kings have defeated is to make the point that that list of nations they defeat is exactly the list of nations who dwell in the land of Canaan, especially the giants. That's a very important point. And if we have time, I will demonstrate how this point plays out in other parts of the Bible as well. That's my point. I did not suggest that the four kings have anything good in mind. It's the farthest thing from Amraphel and these characters. No, the four kings and the five are all the same. That's my point, which is no good, which is true of most kings in the Torah. They're no damn good. There's an exception. There is an exception. We'll see. There's an exception to the rule, but that's an exception. Okay, anybody else?
Silber?
Yes.
The posuk Avraham ישב בארץ כנען ולוט ישב בערי הכיכר ויהל לצדום.
Yes.
I asked myself last time, why does it say ויהל לצדום? But now it looks to me that ויהל לצדום suggests that ערי הכיכר are out of ארץ כנען, but the גבול is Sodom. So Sodom is like the extreme point of Eretz Canaan before you go out of the land.
Right, that's a good point. If we raised this point essentially last time and maybe a couple of weeks ago also, it's not clear about Saddam. You're touching on a very important point. It's we call kind of liminal space. It's hard to know whether Saddam is inside or outside. Your point is very well taken.
Mhm.
It would appear from the previous chapter that maybe Saddam is outside. Avraham dwells in the little land of Kanan, and Lot dwells around Kikar. So it's really unclear, I would say. But it's true that in chapter 13, the Torah contrasts Avraham being in Canaan with these other places. And now in chapter 14, Lot is actually in Saddam, which is why he gets taken. Uyoshev B'Sodom is the reason he had settled in Saddam. And let me make one other point about Saddam in the chapter, which is there are 5 kings, 5 of them, 5 against 4. But then when it describes the war, it separates out 2 of the kings from the other 3. It specifically mentions the king of Sodom and Amorah who fall into the pits. The rest of them run away. And actually, so now from the 5, there's a focus on 2, Sodom and Amorah. And elsewhere, it typically talks about Sodom and Amorah. It's also interesting that Sodom and Amorah, the king of Sodom and the king of Amorah, the names are very striking. There's Bera and there's Birsha. So we take away the bet, you have Resh Shin Ayin, which means wickedness, and Bet Resh Ayin, which is Ra. So Resha and Ra are the 2 kings.
And Bella.
As the Torah says, Ra'im v'chata'im Hashem od. So these are wicked kings. And as the story proceeds through chapter 14, the focus becomes dafka on Sodom. It's the king of Sodom who's going to come out to meet Avraham at the end of the chapter. So there's a movement from 5 to 2 to 1. And the story takes place in Emek Hasidim, which is a further play on the word Sodom. So Sodom is very, very central over here as being maybe the main protagonist of the 5, the main representative of the 5. But my point is the 4 and the 5, they're really all the same. Whether you're the king of big nations or small nations, at the end of the day, it's all about the 4 and the 5 themselves. And we'll see this in the chapter. As the chapter proceeds, how the Torah emphasizes that these kings, it's about the 4 and the 5, as opposed to Avram. Avram is represented completely differently. So let's pick up the story now in verse number 13, and we'll go as far as we can get today. Vayavo hapolit, vayaged li Avram ha'ivri. The polit is a one who flees, a refugee, a survivor. Polat is one who was saved. So the polit, it's interesting, hapolit, with a definite article, hey. So that's why the Medrash says, who is the polit, says the Medrash?
Og.
Og. Of course, we don't take that literally, but it, of course, is making a point. And the point that it's making is exactly the point that I made 15 minutes ago. The Medrash wants us to connect the story of the conquest of the land and God's role in the conquest, as evidenced by the defeating of the giants. And who is the giant that Israel defeats, that represents the fact that God is with us? It's the Og. It's explicit in the Torah. He's the remaining of the Riphaim, of the giants. If we have time in the future, I'll talk more about Riphaim and the role that Riphaim play in the Bible. Very interesting. Vayaged li Avram ha'ivri. And he spoke to Avram the Ivri. Now, what does it mean? Why here does the Torah call him Avram ha'ivri? Interesting. Here they translate this translation, Sephariah, Abram the Hebrew. Avram ha'ivri. Ivri has 2 meanings, both of which are operative in this verse. Aver means the other side. So Avram from the other side could mean, and we know he came from the other side. As it says in the book of Yoshua, we say this in the Haggadah, Be'ever hanahar yoshu avotechem me'olam. Terech avi Avram v'avi Nachar. In the Haggadah, the verse in Yoshua. We say in the Haggadah, our ancestors came from the other side. What it means over here, would presumably is, he told Avram from the other side, the war of the 5 kings against the 4 kings is not Avram's problem. He's from a different place. Why would he get involved in such a war? he has no reason to get involved in such a war except that his load has been captured and he has decided to go out to try to save his relative Lot, despite the fact that they have parted ways and Lot is in Saddam, but he feels a kinship and a responsibility. So that's one meaning of the word Ivri. But the word Ivri has another meaning, because in our study of the Torah, we can never forget the genealogical tables, the genealogies. They're very important. And we know that in between the story of Nimrod and that business over there, and prior to Migdal Bavel, right after Migdal Bavel, we have the descendants of Shem. And when you go down the generations of Shem, at the end of chapter 11, his great-grandson is Aver. In fact, the expression Shem and Aver is a popular expression in the Midrash, the Beit Midrash of Shem and Aver. So Avram is the Ivri. He descends from Aver. What does that mean, descends from Aver? He descends from Shem. So the point of the story is, he descends from Shem, and Shem is the son of Noah, whom Noah blessed. What did Noah say to Shem? Vihi Kanan Eved Lamo. Shem will subjugate Kanan. Avram is the 10th generation for Noah. His mission was to carry out the blessing of Noah, to capture the land of Canaan. So over here, the Torah reminds us that Avram is a descendant of Shem, and it probably mentions Aver specifically because I believe Aver is the 4th generation. So 4 generations is an interesting number. Actually, we have in the next chapter. So Aver then has 2 meanings. It means somebody who comes from a different place, who ordinarily you would think would not want to get involved. That's number 1. But he does get involved. But number 2, and importantly for the chapter, is the chapter keeps reminding us of that earlier chapter of the Tower of Babel, of the genealogies, of Shem, of the blessing of Shem. So he's Avram HaIvri. Avram was living amongst the Amori. Achi Eshkol v'Achi Aner. He dwells with Eshkol and Aner and Mamre. They're Amorites. Behem Baalei Brit Avram. They are Avram's allies. So Avram is living with people, Amori, who are also attacked, by the way. Amori were one of the nations mentioned earlier. But he's in a secure place. In other words, he's in a place, the others have left the land, and Avram is in a place of friends. They're called Baalei Brit Avram. So he doesn't have a reason per se to get involved in a war. Nonetheless, in the very next verse, Vayishma Avram ki nishma achiv. Avram hears that Achiv, his brother, in this case his relative, has been taken captive. And he springs into action. What does he do? Vayarek et chanichav yuridei beito, shmona asar ushlosh meot, vayidof adan. Vayarek et chanichav, they translate he musters. Vayarek maybe he empties out. He takes with him chanichav. A chanich, and nowadays we call chanich kind of a pupil or protege. Chanoch. Chanukat habayis is a dedication. The people that are, one might say, dedicated to him, perhaps his pupils, his disciples, those also born in his house, which could be additional people. They're described as chanichav, yuridei beito, and here the Torah gives us a number, 318. In Gematria, it's actually Eliezer. I've always wondered about this number 318. It's bothered me for 40 years, what it actually signifies, and I don't have a good answer. I constantly think about this number 318. It's a chapter where numbers matter. So I suspect that the number 318 has some significance. And I've been racking my brains for 40 years to try to figure it out, and the answer is I do not know. The Gematria is interesting, that's Eliezer. And maybe there's more to Gematria than I suspect. In any event, it gives us the specific number. Chanichim yuridei beito, vayidof adan. He went in pursuit as far as Dan. We know of Dan in the Bible later as being a northern border. So let's assume he goes up north. From the context, he's traveling up north. Vayechalek alehem laila. He deploys against them, literally divides up his people. Hu v'avadav, himself, and now we have avadav. So we have chanichav, yulidei beito, we have who? We have avadav, his servants. Vayakem, he defeats the 4 kings. Vayirdefaim ad chovah, Hashem mismo l'damasek. And he chases them to a place called Chovah. Small, we counted small earlier. It means north. He travels to the north of Damascus. It's a long journey. Now, I'm not going to ask the question. At this point in time, he's minimally 75 years old, much older. He may be well into his 80s or more. How could he travel this tremendous journey with these people, untrained army, and defeat these 4 powerful kings? Is not a question the Torah wants us to ask. But that's the story that we're given. I mean, it does try to answer it in a certain way. He does all this. Vayashiv et kol harachush, gam et lot achiv u'rechusho heshiv. He restores all the possessions. He brings back Lot and Lot's possessions. He brings back the women. He brings back the rest of the people. And the king of Sodom comes out to greet him. Let me read a little bit more here. King of Sodom comes out to greet him after he defeated Kedala Omer. We'll get to this later on. Then Malki Tzedek appears in verse number 19, verse 18 and 19. And Avram talks to Malki Tzedek. And then the king of Sodom resumes his conversation. He says, you can take the possessions, give me the people. And Avram says to him, I'm not taking anything from you. And in verse 24, the last verse, and we'll go back. No, he says, I'm not taking from myself. However, the Na'arim, the young ones, so he refers to the people with him as Na'arim and Anashim. They deserve their portion. So it's interesting, the description here of the Torah of the battle. There's Avram, there's who? There's Chanichim, that's 2. There's Yulidei Beito is 3. Avadav is 4. Narim is 5. Anashim is 6. Anashim is 6. Aner Eshkolu Mamre, I would say that's 9. I mention this for the following reason. It struck me this morning, actually, that in this chapter, the king of Sodom comes out to greet Avram. And then, before we hear what the king of Sodom has to say, he comes out in verse 17, and suddenly the Torah stops with the king of Sodom, and we have the conversation with Malki Tzedek. Malki Tzedek comes to greet him, brings out bread and wine, and he gives 2 blessings. We'll get to this. And Avram, we are told, and he gave him a tithe, a tenth of everything. He gives Malki Tzedek a maaser. So let me just preliminarily, I want to talk about this giving of the maaser. First of all, I presume that it means that Avram gives Malki Tzedek a maaser. That's the translation over here. I think it's correct. He gives him a tenth. And the point of giving him a tenth is that what he's saying in effect is, because Malki Tzedek says, blesses the God who has assisted you. Shem bigain savecha biyadecha. Now I just pointed out that in terms of Avram and his allies who are successful in the war, there are 9, right? There's himself, Aner Eshkol and Mamre, and 5 other descriptions of Chanichim, Yulidei Beito, Avadim, Na'arim, and Anashim. That's 9. There's actually a 10th who assisted him. So he gives him the maaser, representing the fact that he acknowledges that victory was only possible. Yes, there's the human beings who engage, of course, but there's also divine assistance. That's the missing 10th. So vayitengo maaser mikol, he gave him a tithe. I thought about that this morning as a possible understanding of the maaser mikol, but of course, there's something else about the maaser mikol. And before I get to the key part of the story, which is Melchizedek. Melchizedek is central to the story of supreme significance, Melchizedek. Let me make a different point about Melchizedek. Melchizedek, this mysterious character, appears in verse number 18 after Avram's victory. And he's the king. Melchizedek is both a priest, he's a Kohen Le'eloyon, he is a priest of the high God, but he's also a king. He's Melech Shalem, the king of Salem, the king of Shalem. He comes to greet Avram after the victory. We'll talk more about Melchizedek soon. But I want to make a different point about Melchizedek, which is Melchizedek is Melchizedek, which is the virtuous or the righteous king. So the chapter 14, among other things, is about kingship. There are 10 kings in the chapter, it turns out, aren't there? Torah makes that point, 5 against 4. 5 and 4 is 9. And we know what the 5 are and the 4 are. It's all about themselves, which is the worst thing you can say about a leader when it's about just himself. But there's one king who's not that way, just one. And that's the Melchizedek. Maybe the Torah is making a point about kingship in general. 1 out of 10 is good. And of course, Avram recognizes the virtue of Melchizedek because he gives them a 10th. Because he is the 10th. He's the 1 out of 10 in chapter 14. So that's the tithe. Now I wanted to get to, at least to begin with what is central to this story. The claim that I make is that what's central to chapter 14 and what is significant is that what Avraham has done in chapter 14 is to possess the land of Kanan in a symbolic way. He doesn't actually possess it. But he defeats the kings who have defeated the peoples that dwell in Kanan, both the Canaanites, the Amori, but also the Rephaim, Emim, Zuzim, etc. Anakim, Nephilim. So Melchizedek comes to greet him. Melchizedek is God's representative on earth, who Kohen Le'el Elyon. And what he does is he gives 2 blessings. It's interesting, by the way, Rashi quotes a Medrash. Who is Melchizedek? The Medrash always likes to give us more information about mysterious characters. Who is Melchizedek? Who is this righteous king? Rashi says 3 or 4 words. Who? And 3 more words. Shem ben Noach. Says Rashi, Melchizedek is to be identified with Shem. So of course, that fits perfectly with what I've been suggesting. Because the point of the story is that Shem is the one who is given the blessing by Noach, you shall subdue Canaan. What Avraham has just done effectively is to capture the land of Canaan. So Melchizedek, recognizing what Avraham has done, comes out to bless. And he's a Kohen. Kohanim give blessings. The role of the priest is to bless. It's the priest Melchizedek in chapter 14 of Genesis who blesses. It's, for example, Yitro, the Kohen of Midian, who in chapter 18, after Israel leaves Egypt, comes and blesses Israel and blesses God. Baruch Hashem asher hitzil etchem miyad Mitzrayim umiyad Paro, asher hitzil et ami tachat yad Mitzrayim. That was the priestly blessing of Yitro after the battle, after the victory against Mitzrayim. And now we have Melchizedek, the priest blessing after the victory against the 4 kings, in effect, the victory against the peoples of Canaan, the giants. And what is the nature of the blessing? So actually, when we look at this, these 2 verses, we'll begin now. And next time we meet, I want to pick this up. Vayevracheu vayomar, verse number 19. Baruch Avraham li'el elyon, konei shamayim v'aretz. Blessed is Avram to the high God, El Elyon. Konei shamayim v'aretz. Konei is typically translated as creator of heaven and earth. So what does that mean? Avram, you are blessed to God, the creator of shamayim v'aretz. So I want to make the following suggestion as to what this means. The Torah begins with 2 creation narratives. The first creation narrative is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. And the second creation narrative begins with Ewa Toldot Hashemayim v'Haaretz b'Hibaram. This is the story of the creation of heaven and earth when they were created b'Hibaram. That's, I think, verse 4 of chapter 2. And that's the introduction after Vayichulu to the second creation narrative. The first creation narrative is about creation of heaven and earth. And the second creation narrative is within the creation of heaven and earth, there's another creation, which is a specific place, a chosen place that the Torah calls the Garden of Eden. Some people think these two creation narratives, which of course are very different, are somehow contradictory. But they're not actually contradictory, not in the Torah's eyes. One is one might say, a fulfillment of the other. The second creation narrative is different, no question about it, but it's a fulfillment of the first. That's how the Torah begins in chapter 2. Ewa Toldot Hashemayim v'Haaretz b'Hibaram. Interesting is the Medrash. B'Hibaram points out Avraham, the letters of Abraham's name. And what it's saying is actually pointing to something which is the pshat of the Chumash. What Malki Tzedek is saying to Avraham is, Avraham, in your possession of the sacred space, which we call the alternative to the Garden of Eden, you have fulfilled God's purpose in creation. The purpose of creation, even of Genesis 1, was actually Genesis 2 and 3. That's a fulfillment of God's purpose. So you are blessed to God because you are carrying out God's will. You are doing God's work in this world. And therefore, you are blessed because you are fulfilling God's work in this world. And the next verse, Uvaruch El Elyon, Hashem migain sarecha biyadecha, and blessed is the high God, Hashem migain sarecha, who delivered your enemies into your hands. What does that mean? Blessed is God who has enabled you to do your work. Hashem migain sarecha, because after all, you old man, how could you defeat these powerful kings if not without God's help? Hashem migain sarecha, who delivered your foes into your hand. So there were two blessings. One blessing talks about Avram's ability to fulfill Avram's mission in this world, which is to do God's work. Which God? The God of creation, Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, the creator, the high God. And blessed is the God, Hashem migain sarecha biyadecha. Now these two verses, and I'll stop with this thought next time maybe to pick this up. I'm thinking of giving a course sometime in the future about these two verses. I mean a course. And the course is about, other people have written about this and spoken about it, but I think I have a good deal to say about this. And that is the biblical roots of prayer. Because when you read these two verses, it is obvious, and it's been obvious to many people, though they typically don't, in my view, understand what it signifies, that these two verses contain within them three terms that are central to our basic prayer. One is Eloyon, one is Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, or in the version of the Ashkenazic, or the, not Ashkenazic, the Babylonian version, Konei Hakol, and Migain Sarecha Biyadecha Magain Avraham. That these two verses form the backbone, the basis for the very first blessing of our core prayer, which is we call the Amidah, or the Shemona Esrei. Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, El Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanara El Elyon, Komel Chasadim Tovim v'Konei Hakol, Yerushalmi et Konei Shemayim Va'aretz, Baruch Atah Hashem Magain Avraham. And there's a reason for that, that the rabbis chose these two verses for our prayers. Because what the Amidah is about, they are suggesting, is the following. I stand in prayer before God and saying, I want to do your work in this world. Everybody has a different task in this world. No one knows what the other guy's task is. Everybody tries to figure out what their task is, my task. So I stand before God and say, God, I want to do your work in this world. And after I say that, that's how I begin my Shemona Esrei. I turn to the middle section and I say, God, I want to do your work in this world, but in order to do your work in this world, I need your help. I need the ability to make some good decisions. I need to be recognized that I'm not hopelessly stained with sin. I need good health. I need to make a living. I need to live in a secure place. Those are the intermediate requests in what we call the Shemona Esrei, the Bakoshot. But the purpose, actually, those Bakoshot is Baruch Eloyon Hashem Migein Sarecha Biyadecha, the God who has enabled you to do your work. That's our request in the middle of the Shemona Esrei. But the Shemona Esrei begins with verse number 19, which is Baruch Avraham Eloyon Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. You have fulfilled God's purpose. You have symbolically, in conquering the land of Kanan, the sacred space, you are fulfilling the purpose of the God described both in the first verse of the Bible and in the second, beginning to the second creation narrative. This is the story of Shemayim Va'aretz in its being created. Says the Medrash in a terrific insight, Behibaram, Avraham. Avraham is the one who secures the sacred space. We'll continue next time with this. That's what I was thinking of teaching in the future. The biblical roots of prayer, beginning with a good understanding of the Bible. Of course, they understand the Bible. If you want to see the Bible as the foundation of prayer, it's helpful to understand the Bible. I'll stop at this point. If any comments or questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. On the schedule, we don't meet next week because it's Thanksgiving weekend. If there's a change, people will be notified. Right now, there is no class next week, and then we'll resume in 2 weeks. If there's any change, you'll be notified. Anybody have any comments or questions?
Yeah, possibly. Possibly, Migein Sarecha Biyodecha and Magen Avraham are both alluding to Gan, and so this is actually exactly the second Garden of Eden.
I'm not sure I would go there. But by the way, Anochi Magen Lach is the beginning of chapter 15. The next chapter begins with "Do not be afraid, Anochi Magen Lach." We will see that chapter, and the rabbis understood this. That chapter 15, which is the covenant in chapter 15, is based on chapter 14. I want to talk more about this next time. Anybody else have anything to say?
Yes, the word Kaine Shemayim Va'aretz, when Eve names her son the same root Cain,
Yes.
there is also an indication here,
Hashem.
right, of the future, that it's not only a whole series, not only Avraham, but everything that comes afterwards.
True. Kaniti at Hashem, I have created, or perhaps made, actually. There's the word koneh probably means to create. So that probably also means koneh there. So just please, just repeat the comment. I'm not understanding the point you're making.
So repeat the comment you're saying?
Yes. Well, just
okay. Just as Eve makes a reference to her partnership with God in continuing the world, in giving birth, there is also an allusion here to that even though this is Avraham, but there is also a continuity.
I see what you're saying. Yes, right.
It.
Yeah, that's an interesting way. Yeah, it's an interesting formulation to see the human being as sort of joining up with God, that jointly. That we need, which is basically a very nice formulation of what I was saying, which is we always need God's help in all things because we're all limited, and we need the inspiration and insight and whatever. And that's our first request: is to know what the right thing to do is. It's not easy to know, and that the human endeavor is to somehow find ways to partner up with God. Sometimes God takes the first step, sometimes we take the first step, but to see ourselves in partnership, in trying together to build something for the future. That's a nice formulation. I like that very much. We will see next time. By the way, as I mentioned, the Yerushalmi, the language of the Yerushalmi, we have Konei Hakol, the creator of all. The Yerushalmi had Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, and Friday night, when we have the text of the Amidah, the short text of the Amidah after the Shemona Esrei Friday night, that's based on the language of the Talmud Yerushalmi. There it's You have those three terms, one after the other, right? You have
Magen
Kel Elyon, Koni Shamayim Va'aretz, Magen Avot Bidvaro. You have three terms, actually one after the next. You have El Elyon, Koni Shamayim Va'aretz, and then this is Magen Avot. Because the Yerushalmi's text was not Magen Avraham, as we have, it was Magen Avot. But at least the three terms come together in the repetition of the Amidah on Friday nights, and you see straight up that, and this is what let me just end with the following observation, which is the text of our prayer service is made up by the rabbis, by the teachers, by the rabbis. They make it up, whoever it was, actually Knesset Agdola, doesn't matter. And they choose a particular story in the Torah on which to build our prayers. And what is striking is that the primary text used to construct our most important prayer, which is the first blessing of the Amidah, it comes from Melchizedek. Apart from the fact that he's a non-Jew, which is interesting, that's a separate thing. He's not Jewish. He's calling it El Elyon. Doesn't even say Hashem. Avraham says Hashem later. We'll get to it. Not Melchizedek. But you see something. They understood that chapter 14 is something about this statement in chapter 14 that is so central, that is so unbelievably important. When they constructed the prayers for Yom Kippur, it's the golden calf that's the central text of Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, Akedas Yitzchak. We understand those stories are of supreme significance. They're in the top 10, maybe the top 5. But Melchizedek, they understood the Melchizedek story of chapter 14 as being a central text for our tradition. That's what's very interesting. And I think it teaches us something about studying Torah, that got to keep our eyes open. It's all important. But in the text, some stories stand out. And they saw this story as standing out. And when we continue next time, we'll see why they saw the story as standing out, because I think they had a very deep insight into the significance of chapter 14. So I'll stop at this point. Again, we don't meet next week at this point. If there's a change in the schedule, everybody will be notified. If you have any other questions, you can send me an email, dsilber@drisha.org. I'm happy to respond if I can. So have a good day. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. And thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.